All right, buckle up, because today we're diving headfirst into the wild world of the American auto industry.
And when I say wild, I mean wild.
We're talking roaring engines, clashing titans, and more twists and turns than a factory assembly line.
A real roller coaster, this one.
And to navigate this beast, we've got our trusty guide, Crash Course by Paul Ingrassia.
A must-read for anyone who wants the inside scoop on how Detroit went from ruling the road to, well, facing some serious roadblocks.
And that's putting it mildly. You know, I read this crazy anecdote in Ingrassia's book, Picture This. It's the late 1980s, Detroit's on its heels, and you've got people leaving prison who would rather stay put.
Wait, what? Why on earth would they?
Because on the inside, they had a roof, they had food, they had some sense of security. On the outside, that was a different story altogether, especially in a city that had lost its way.
Wow, that's pretty bleak. Talk about a fall from grace.
It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? And that's precisely what we're here to unpack. How did Detroit become the envy of the world, this industrial powerhouse, only to stumble and fall so hard?
It's a story of innovation, ambition, but also hubris, mismanagement, and maybe even a little bit of bad luck thrown in for good measure.
Absolutely. But let's rewind to the beginning, to the early 20th century, when a certain Henry Ford burst onto the scene with this crazy idea, a car for the masses.
Ah, the Model T, the car that put America on wheels.
The Model T was revolutionary, no doubt. But what really set Ford apart, what really sent shockwaves through the world, was his relentless pursuit of efficiency.
He was obsessed with it. And that's where the moving assembly line comes in, this game-changing innovation that, get this, was actually inspired by meatpacking plants.
Meatpacking? You're kidding.
Nope. Dead serious. Ford saw how efficiently those plants operated, and he thought, why not apply that to car manufacturing?
And the rest, as they say, is history.
Not so fast. While Ford's genius for efficiency is undeniable, let's not forget his darker side. This was a man who harbored some pretty nasty prejudices, and he wasn't afraid to use his considerable platform to spread them.
You're talking about his anti-Semitism and how he used his newspaper to promote those views.
Exactly. And unfortunately, this kind of unchecked power, this willingness to put profits and personal agendas ahead of ethics, well, it would come back to haunt the industry later on.
It's a reminder that even the most brilliant minds, the most innovative companies, are capable of making some pretty grave missteps.
Absolutely. But for now, let's shift gears, so to speak, and talk about another titan of the industry, General Motors, a company born from the boundless ambition of one William Billy Durant.
Talk about a character, right?
Oh, Durant was one of a kind. He built General Motors by, shall we say, acquiring anything with wheels and an engine.
He was like a kid in a candy store, scooping up all these different car brands, each with its own identity, its own quirks.
It was a bit chaotic, to be honest, which is why when Alfred Sloan took over, he brought a very different approach.
Sloan was all about organization, about streamlining, about understanding what made consumers tick.
And boy, did he understand consumers. Sloan had this incredible insight that would shape the industry for decades to come. He realized that Americans didn't just want basic transportation. They craved something more: style, status, a way to express themselves.
So, in a way, Sloan was a visionary marketer, recognizing that desire for aspiration and tapping into it.
Exactly. And that insight, that understanding of the American psyche, would set the stage for Detroit's dominance, but also perhaps sow the seeds of its eventual decline.
It's almost poetic in a way. This little car, this Beetle, puttering along, capturing hearts, while Detroit, with all its muscle and might, just missed it, completely missed it.
Talk about a blind spot, right? They underestimated the little guy, and they paid the price.
Big time. But I can kind of see how it happened. They were riding high, top of the world, kings of the road. Why change a winning game, right?
That's the thing about success, isn't it? It can make you complacent, even a little bit arrogant. And Detroit, well, let's just say they were in no hurry to change their tune. They had their formulas, their chrome-laden, gas-guzzling formulas, and they stuck to them.
And who could blame them? At least in the beginning, people were lining up for those cars.
True, but what they failed to see was that the world was changing. Consumers were starting to crave something different, something smaller, more fuel-efficient, more sensible.
And the Beetle, in all its quirky glory, just happened to fit the bill.
Exactly. But it wasn't just about looks or even fuel efficiency. The Beetle had this reputation for reliability, for affordability. It was the people's car in a way that those big American cars with their ever-increasing price tags just weren't.
It's like they forgot about the average Joe, the everyday driver who just needed a reliable set of wheels.
You hit the nail on the head. And speaking of nails in the coffin, the 1970s rolled around and dealt Detroit a 1-2 punch they never saw coming.
The oil crisis. Oof, yeah, that must have been a real wake-up call.
It was a game changer. Suddenly, fuel efficiency wasn't just a nice-to-have. It was a necessity. And guess who was ready, with open arms and fuel-sipping engines? The Japanese automakers.
Talk about being the right place at the right time.
It was more than just timing, though. The Japanese had been honing their craft, perfecting their production techniques, building cars that were, frankly, more reliable and often more affordable than their American counterparts.
So what did Detroit do? Did they scramble? Did they panic?
There was definitely a sense of urgency, a realization that they needed to adapt. But their response was, well, let's just say it wasn't always the most graceful.
You're being diplomatic.
I tried. Remember the Chevrolet Vega? That was supposed to be their big answer to the imports, their entry into the small car market.
I vaguely remember my uncle having one. Wasn't a big fan, if I recall.
Yeah, well, your uncle wasn't alone. The Vega became infamous for its quality issues, its mechanical problems, its rust.
Rust? Seriously?
Yeah, it was bad. But the Vega's failure went beyond just bad design or shoddy materials. It exposed some deeper issues within Detroit, a kind of systemic rot that had been festering for years.
Like what?
Like a short-sighted focus on profits over quality, a disconnect between management and the factory floor, and an increasingly adversarial relationship with the UAW. Remember those generous union contracts we talked about earlier?
Right, the ones that were supposed to bring labor peace.
Well, they came at a cost that was increasingly being passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices, and some would argue lower quality.
It's like a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Higher wages lead to higher prices, which make the cars less competitive, which then puts more pressure on everyone to cut corners.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, just as Detroit was grappling with these internal struggles, they got hit with a series of scandals that really tarnished their reputation.
You're talking about Ralph Nader and the Chevrolet Corvair. That was a PR nightmare for GM.
It was a watershed moment for the industry. Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed, exposed the safety hazards of the Corvair's rear engine design and really shone a light on Detroit's willingness to prioritize profits over safety.
And then there was the Ford Pinto fiasco, where those cost-cutting measures on the fuel tank design had those tragic and very public consequences.
Those scandals really eroded public trust in Detroit. People started to see them as out of touch, more concerned with their bottom line than with the safety and well-being of their customers.
It's amazing how quickly a reputation, especially one built over decades, can crumble.
It's a reminder that trust is a fragile thing, easily broken, and once broken, incredibly difficult to rebuild.
And in the meantime, you had companies like Honda coming in, not just with better cars, but with a completely different philosophy, a different way of treating their workers. They actually called them associates, not just employees.
Honda's approach was revolutionary for the time. They emphasized teamwork, collaboration, and a genuine respect for their workers. It was a stark contrast to the often adversarial relationship between management and labor in Detroit.
And guess what? It worked. Honda's cars were known for their quality, their reliability, and their fuel efficiency. They were everything that Detroit wasn't at that moment.
They were the future, even if Detroit didn't quite realize it yet.
So the 1970s were rough, real rough. But the 80s, well, they brought a glimmer of hope, wouldn't you say?
A glimmer, yes, but also a whole lot of struggle.
Yeah.
Detroit was wounded, trying to find its footing in a world that had changed dramatically.
It's like they were a boxer, knocked down but not out, trying to regain their balance. And one of the most dramatic comebacks, at least for a while, had to be Chrysler, right?
Oh, Chrysler was on the ropes, no doubt about it. They were bleeding money, on the verge of collapse.
And then Lee Iacocca enters the ring, this charismatic, straight-talking CEO who wasn't afraid to fight for his company.
Iacocca was a force of nature. He knew that Chrysler needed a lifeline, and he wasn't afraid to ask for it. Hence the government bailout, a controversial move, but one that bought them precious time.
Time to regroup, rethink, and reinvent, which is exactly what they did.
Iacocca understood that Chrysler couldn't compete head-on with the Japanese on fuel efficiency alone. So he focused on practicality, affordability, and, dare I say, innovation.
Innovation? What did they come up with?
The minivan. Can you believe it? Before Chrysler, the minivan was just this, well, uncool afterthought. But Ayakaka saw an opportunity, a way to cater to families, to offer them something practical and affordable.
And it worked. Those things were everywhere. Soccer moms, dads on the go, the minivan became synonymous with suburban life.
And let's not forget about the K-car, another Ayakaka brainchild. It wasn't flashy, but it was reliable, affordable, and it sold like hotcakes.
Chrysler, the comeback kid. I love it. And then you had Ford, also going through their own transformation under CEO Donald Peterson.
Peterson was a different breed than Iacocca. Less flamboyant, more methodical, but just as effective.
He was all about quality, about design, about shedding that old image of Ford as the maker of, well, let's just say, less than exciting cars.
And nothing embodied that shift better than the Ford Taurus.
Taurus, I remember that car. It was everywhere in the late 80s.
Exactly. The Taurus was sleek, it was modern, it was unlike anything Ford had ever produced before. It was a hit with consumers, and it signaled to the world that Ford was back in the game.
So we've got Chrysler and Ford, both down but not out, both finding their way back to relevance. And then there's GM.
Ah, yes, GM.
Yeah.
The sleeping giant, slow to wake up to the new realities of the auto industry.
They seem to be stuck in this weird limbo, not quite sure what to do, trying everything and nothing all at the same time.
They went through a period of massive restructuring, trying to streamline their operations, but it often felt like they were just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
They even bought Ross Perot's EDS, which turned out to be a colossal mistake.
A billion-dollar blunder. They were trying to diversify, to get into the tech game, but it was like watching your grandpa trying to breakdance at a wedding.
Painful. And meanwhile, while they were busy with all of this, the core business, the cars, well, they weren't exactly setting the world on fire.
They were churning out these, well, uninspired vehicles that seemed more focused on following trends than setting them. They were playing catch-up, and they were losing.
It's like they were stuck in a time warp, clinging to past glories while the world passed them by.
A classic case of a company too big, too bureaucratic, too slow to adapt.
And then, just as they were trying to find their footing, the 2008 financial crisis hit, and the whole world went haywire.
It was the perfect storm. The auto industry was already reeling from declining sales, soaring gas prices, and then bam. The economy collapses, credit markets freeze up, and suddenly nobody's buying cars.
And that's when the government stepped in with that massive bailout, right? A move that sparked a whole lot of debate about corporate welfare and the role of government.
It was a defining moment, not just for the auto industry, but for the country. Should these companies be saved? Were they too big to fail? Or were they just too big to succeed?
It was a tough call, no doubt about it. But in the end, both GM and Chrysler were forced to declare bankruptcy to go through this painful process of restructuring and reinvention.
Bankruptcy, while often seen as a failure, can also be an opportunity for a fresh start. It allows companies to shed debt, to renegotiate contracts, to emerge leaner and hopefully more competitive.
And that's essentially what happened with GM and Chrysler. They shed brands, closed factories, and renegotiated labor agreements. It was a tough pill to swallow, but it ultimately paved the way for their survival.
It was a painful rebirth, no doubt, but it allowed them to shed some of those old habits, those old ways of thinking that had led them down that path in the first place.
So here we are, having journeyed through the triumphs, the tragedies, and the sheer tenacity of the American auto industry.
It's a story that's far from over, a story that continues to unfold with every new technological innovation, every shifting consumer demand, every global challenge.
From the Model T to the minivan, from the gas-guzzling behemoths of the past to the electric vehicles of the future, the road ahead is sure to be filled with twists and turns.
But one thing's for sure, the American auto industry, much like the country it represents, has a remarkable ability to adapt, to innovate, to reinvent itself.
Only time will tell what the next chapter holds. But that's the beauty of it all, isn't it? The open road, the endless possibilities, the constant drive to move forward. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of the American auto industry. Until next time, keep those engines revving.